Okay. Well, hello everyone. So the idea of paradigm shifting as when I was talking with Steve about this presentation, he was saying, yes, well, that's an idea that's a word that's gotten used a lot, which it has over the last, half a century or so, um, since it was really introduced into our lexicon. And and as with all words that get used a lot, they start to lose some of their meaning. Uh, so we use the term paradigm shift to we commonly use it for things that probably are beyond are not don't quite rise to the standard of the original term. Uh, so the original term really came into our lexicon largely through a book called "The Structures of Scientific Revolutions" by Thomas Kuhn, and he was looking at that in a very interesting way. He was essentially saying he was a historian of science. So he was looking at the history of science. His book is magnificent, by the way. He was looking at the history of science, and he said, we believe that science is a linear progression of increasing knowledge about reality. That's the story we tell ourselves. We tell ourselves that this modern science started a few hundred years ago, and through experimentation and discovery and creating hypotheses and testing those, we have gradually added newer and newer pieces of understanding about reality. And we're sort of marching along on a track toward greater understanding. And he said, well, if you actually look at the history, it doesn't really look like that at all. Um, he says it looks like that for periods of time, which he calls uh, normal science. During times of normal science, that's what happens is basic ideas get developed and grown. But he said periodically you experience something that he calls uh, revolutionary science, which results in a paradigm shift. And when a paradigm shift occurs, you don't just have the next moment in the linear progression of science, you have a radical shift in all of the assumptions that the earlier science was built on. So if you go back and look at the earlier science, you can't really say that that science led through some linear progression to the next, that there was some kind of a leap that occurred that allowed all of science to be on a completely different footing. And so if you think about the idea of a paradigm in that sense, you are talking about something that is it's a radical shift. And I use the word radical because it comes from Latin roots uh, that mean, well, it comes from Latin roots that do actually mean roots. So a radical shift means a shift under the roots. So a paradigm shift is a shift that goes under the roots of what exists and upends the ground that everything is resting on. So we do experience that, and you all just talked about that for 15 minutes. We experience moments in our lives that, to some extent or another, change the ground we're standing on. Sometimes those are smaller, the way we use the term paradigm shift now, they can be less radical. I guess it depends on how deeply under the roots you dig. How much of the ground is being replaced. And so when Thomas Kuhn was going through the history of science, he was just coming up with all of these uh, fascinating paradigm shifts that occurred in chemistry, in biology, in science, and saying it's only after the fact that new science textbook, like a revolution occurs in science. Could be the revolution of modern science. Could be, I mean, that one's a little harder because it's so new. The new physics of the early 20th century. But if you go back further to the he talks a lot about the development of the periodic table of elements and what a radical paradigm shift that was. Only after that do new textbooks get written, and those textbooks recreate the history of science to make it look linear. And at least in his book, he says we need that because we want to feel like we are progressing in some kind of predictable, linear way toward greater knowledge. We don't really want to think that uh, our knowledge bases are being radically altered periodically. So that because what that means is the foundation we're currently standing on could be uprooted at some point, and that's not as comfortable an idea for us as the idea that we're simply adding to a foundation that's stable. Now, when Kuhn talked about uh, paradigm shifts, one of the things he said, which I think is really fascinating, he said paradigms shift in one of three ways, basically, because it's not a linear progression. So it doesn't progress through sort of it's not a rational, logical development. So one of the ways they progress is because there is some kind of persistent problem that sort of come hell or high water, the existing science cannot solve. And people will just bang their head against the wall and bang their head against the wall and bang their head against the wall until some radical, until somebody just radically feels like there's got to be another way. I'm going to give you a little personal example of this. This would be a paradigm shift from my life that is not exactly a radical one, but it was kind of awesome at the time. Years ago, I was an engineer. And one of the things I did as an engineer was I ran something called an electron ion etcher, which was this big vacuum chamber that etched silicon wafers for computers. There came a time when suddenly everything that was going in this machine and everything we sold had to go through this machine. Everything that went through this machine ended up with this little tiny, you couldn't see it, but you could measure it, little tiny layer of copper on everything. And if you have copper on silicon chips, that's really bad because it just shorts everything out. And so it was my job to figure out what was going on, and I could not. And I was not senior enough to really come up with a lot of ideas. Every day, all the senior scientists would meet, come up with theories about why copper was ending up in the machine. I would then do experiments to try and determine it wouldn't work. New theories the next day, wouldn't work. This went on for weeks. And of course, what happened is the theories had to get wilder and wilder and wilder because they ran out of all the easy theories. And so then it was all these kind of bizarre plasma situations that might be happening. I mean, and these guys were very, very smart. So they could come up with theories forever. There's no end of theories to how this copper was getting in the machine. And finally, I was just so sick of doing these experiments. So I was in the position of a persistent problem that couldn't be solved. I just needed a break one day, right? So this is the left field. I just couldn't do it. One more day of more test runs. And so I said, oh, I think I'm going to clean the machine today. Now, I'd cleaned the machine already 100 times, but I wanted a longer break. So I really cleaned it. I pulled it completely apart. I was going to spend the whole day. And what happened was, as I was pulling the machine apart, I took some of the plates out and way in the bottom, there was a penny that somebody had dropped in the machine. And that was the source of all the copper. That the penny was giving off copper while the machine was running. And no matter how long we spent in that office coming up with theories, nobody was going to come up with a theory that someone had dropped a penny in the bottom of the machine by mistake. And so the paradigm breaking move was me getting so fed up that I couldn't do another day's worth of experiments. And I just, as an excuse to waste a day, clean the machine. But that just kind of gives you a humorous way to to think about that particular form. That's one particular way that paradigms tend to shift. Another way, which is sort of the opposite of that, is, well, I don't know if it's the opposite, but it's the other end of some spectrum. The other way that paradigm shift is you experience an anomaly to what's supposed to be possible. So something happens and that just should not be possible. Now, obviously, if it happens once, you just ignore it. But if something consistently happens that shouldn't be possible, it will eventually force people to rethink the foundations that would say that's impossible. And so that's the second way that paradigm shift. And the last way, which is sort of the more mystical way, is that someone out of the blue will just have some kind of almost mystical like revelation of a new possibility. And that happens periodically. And when it does happen, as the physicist Max Planck said, it will take a generation for that mystical revelation to be accepted, because all of the existing scientists will have to retire or die, because those kinds of revelations just don't get accepted very easily, because it's just one person's idea. And even if you're testing it and it's working, it's very hard to get it accepted. Einstein's theories of relativity were a classic example. I mean, he sort of just thought those up. They didn't come from any experiments he was doing, and most of the ways that you could possibly test the theory weren't possible. So it was years. I mean, it was, I think, 20 years ago, one of the tests of special relativity or general relativity was finally able to be done, and Einstein was proved, he proved to be right, but it took a long time, decades, before that experiment could happen. So one of the things that I really would want to convey to you about paradigms is that paradigms don't paradigms affect us so deeply that they actually shape our perception of reality. Now I wrote this down, and I hope I can read it, because I don't have my glasses on. So there's a great story. I've often heard it attributed to Wittgenstein, the philosopher Wittgenstein, but I am not 100% sure. Because I've also heard that it was attributed to other people, but I like it attributed to Wittgenstein. So the story goes like this. Uh, Wittgenstein is walking with one of his students, and the student is saying, "Can you believe?" No, Wittgenstein asked the student, "Why do you think it is that for so long everybody thought that the sun went around the earth?" And the student, kind of looked at him, and he looked up at the sky, and he said, "Well, obviously, because it looks like the sun is going around the earth." And Wittgenstein said, "Oh, well, what would it look like if the earth were rotating?" So, of course, the punchline is the earth is rotating, and that is what it looks like. So, why did the student think it was obvious that it looked like the sun was going around the earth? Now, many people would say, and Buckminster Fuller was one of these, that the reason it looks that way is because we live in a paradigm that tells us it's that way. And then we reinforce that belief over and over and over again. Buckminster Fuller was very against calling the event that occurs every morning, calling it sunrise, and calling the event in the evening sunset. Because he said the sun is not rising and the sun is not setting, the earth is rotating. And he thought we should change the morning event to call it morning rotation, and the evening event to call it evening rotation, so that we would actually have a term that represented what was actually happening. So in a test, an experiment that I would recommend, and I have done this, and I find it very powerful every time I do it, When you go, we've all gone to see the sunset. I just saw some beautiful ones a few weeks ago. And it looks like the sun is setting. It looks like the sun is going down. Buckminster Fuller would say that's because we've been taught to think that way. So what I do when I go see a sunset is I hold myself in the recognition that the sun isn't going down, right? But that I am rotating backwards away from the sun, that I'm on a big circular ball and I am moving backwards. And that's why the sun is getting closer and closer to the horizon. And if you do that and you really hold yourself mindfully in a recognition that it's the earth that's rotating away from the sun, not the sun moving down, you will actually begin to feel how, oh yeah, I could see how I could retrain myself to experience that event differently. And so that I would actually start to feel the earth rotating away versus seeing the sun dropping down. Now, Buckminster Fuller thought this was very important because he felt that we needed to feel the planet the way it is. You know, the idea that the sun is setting or that it's rising is kind of a holdover from an earlier time, uh, which didn't, in which common people didn't necessarily recognize that we lived on a gigantic sphere, and they related to the Earth as flat. Buckminster Fuller thought we need to we need to shift our sensibilities so that we can feel the sphere of the Earth rotating, because that's going to help us not destroy the planet we live on. Because that kind of a shift in perception will give us a more realistic sense of what Buckminster Fuller would talk about as spaceship Earth, that we are actually on this sphere, circular, round globe that's rotating quickly and flying through space, which you don't get that sense if you're seeing just a flat expanse that sort of goes on indefinitely. So the point is that our perception of reality is very much shaped by by many of the ideas that we hold, that we believe. Nora Bateson is the daughter of Gregory Bateson, the philosopher. Nora Bateson, in one of her books, writes about the ideas that we hold that are so deep in our psyche, we don't actually recognize them. We don't see them. They're just embedded into our experience of reality. They've become invisible to us. Uh, Alfred North Whitehead. Sorry, just the name left me. Alfred North Whitehead. One of my favorite quotes is Alfred North Whitehead talked about how it takes a very unusual mind to undertake the analysis of the obvious. And I think he's saying the same thing. There's some things that are just so obviously true that it takes a very unusual mind to even consider that they could be other than they appear to be. But that's the depth of inquiry required for paradigm shifting. Uh, excuse me. One of my favorite deep thinkers is the American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce. Charles Sanders Peirce was, among many things, he was the person that was credited even by Ken Wilber as the first nascent form of integral theory, because Charles Sanders Peirce had a theory about I. He had I, it, and its as his. It was a three, so he didn't have the multiple I, but he had the beginning of the idea. Charles Sanders Peirce was also brilliant in many other ways. He was the person who came up with the idea that a meter should not be measured with a, with like a golden meter stick held in Paris, but it should be measured in terms of wavelengths of light. Because if we measured in terms of wavelengths of light in a vacuum, that would be true for everybody, and you wouldn't need one meter stick to hold the true meter. The other thing that he came up with, which I think really shows a certain, I'm trying to point to the kind of thinking that paradigm shifting requires. He worked for the Coast Guard. Uh, Charles Sanders Peirce worked for the Coast Guard, and he did measurements of the bottom of the ocean. This was his job. He put down plumb lines, and he would measure the distance, and then he would pull them back up. And it bothered him that he would make these measurements and they wouldn't come out the same way each time. And we all know this because we took high school physics. So we all knew that you had to take, when you did an experiment, you always had to take 3 measurements and then you use the average of those because there's always human error involved in any measurement. Charles Sanders Peirce he had a notoriously high opinion of himself. Uh, and so in the same way that I was tired of doing experiments, and that led to a paradigm shifting discovery of sorts. Charles Sanders Peirce, because of his very high opinion of himself, would not accept that human error could possibly account for the discrepancies in the measurements he was making. So his conclusion was the only reason that I make measurements and they come up different is because the distance is changing, because reality fluctuates, because uh, when you make the same measurement twice, it's not the same distance anymore because reality is always fluctuating a little bit, and it's not because I'm wrong. I'm definitely measuring right, but reality keeps shifting, which sort of sounds humorous and is kind of humorous, except it actually was a big inspiration to Werner Heisenberg later when Heisenberg came up with the uncertainty principle in quantum physics. So Peirce's insight, which was probably not quite as arrogant as the way I presented it, actually was um, foreshadowing some of the developments of quantum theory, which wouldn't happen for another 50 years uh, after Peirce was writing. So these are just some of the ways of thinking that are necessary. Now, in some of my work, uh, I developed something that I called wormhole inquiries, which were, I think of these as it's a paradigm shifting way of thinking. And I called it wormhole inquiries because you can't really, as I was saying, you can't really get to a paradigm changing insight just through a steady linear march through rational logic. They kind of happen. They kind of come to you as insights. And so I was trying to think of how could we use our minds in ways that would keep us sort of dancing in the general area of a wormhole in consciousness that we might fall into by mistake. And the idea of a wormhole in physics is that it's a wormhole connects two places in the universe that are vastly separate. And when you fall into one end, you fall out the other end immediately, but you're in a completely different place. And these wormhole inquiries, I think, have the possibility of allowing you to fall into one end and fall out of the other end in a completely different place. And I haven't done this for a while, but maybe after this talk, I will consider doing it again. I used to do retreats that were based on wormhole inquiries, and I would give people wormhole inquiries to do, and it was fascinating what would happen. So I will give you an example of one. There are certain foundational assumptions that we accept that they are so deep and so deeply embedded in our experience of reality, we don't recognize them as assumptions. We just think that's the way it is. And those are the ones that Alfred North Whitehead said, or it takes an unusual mind to undertake the analysis of. So one of those is the idea that we think. This is a very fundamental assumption, has been at least since the Enlightenment. It was a magnificent paradigm shifting leap at the start of the Enlightenment. I mean, I even like to think about that. Um, Generally speaking, most people at one time, long, long ago, didn't really see themselves as thinkers. You know, the idea was that God thought, and sometimes we perceived the thoughts of God, but it was very blasphemous to say you thought. That would be you attributing to yourself the powers of God, which is why in the early years of the beginnings of uh, the Enlightenment thinkers who started to get very excited about the idea that we can think for ourselves were generally burned with other pagans for such a blasphemous idea. But now we all think we can think. Whether we can or not, I suppose, is another question, but we definitely think we can. Um, and we have very strong ideas about where thoughts are generated inside of us, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, what I would say to people on retreat, as I would give them an exercise, and I would generally want them to spend a few hours doing this, would be the best, but to go and sit with an object. I like trees, you know, because they're interesting. And just sit and stare at the tree, be with the tree, and notice things about the tree, and see what starts to arise, right, in your mind, and in terms of feelings or thoughts. And if you give yourself a lot of time, you can really get some momentum going in terms of things arising in your mind. But then I would ask people, notice how you are going to relate to that as if you are thinking about the tree, and turn that around and imagine the possibility that the tree is talking to you, that the tree is giving you thoughts, that the tree is transmitting feelings to you. And just sit with that way of being. Put yourself in the world where that's what you were taught. That's what everybody was taught from the beginning. Uh, and the thing with wormhole inquiry is it's not about proving that the alternative is right. That would kind of defeat the whole purpose. It's about putting yourself in a place where that alternative possibility, in this case, that the tree is talking to you, where you authentically recognize that your experience could equally well be explained that way as the traditional way. Not that it doesn't have to be better explained. You just need to come to the place where you go, oh my God, it really could be that way. Like that could be what's happening. And it's in the that could be what's happening where the magic is. It's in the possibility that a radical difference could be true, that you have uh, a little bit of space, right? Because what you're looking for in paradigm shifting is a little bit of not knowing, but at a very, very deep level. But you don't need a lot of not knowing, just a little. A crack of not knowing can allow something to slip in. So here's my favorite not knowing story. Um, I used to be a I used to be a school teacher, actually, uh, generally high school. for a long time middle school, and once or twice elementary school. Because I was a substitute teacher. I did not really like elementary school. I, I didn't understand what you were supposed to do. I didn't get it. I didn't have the patience for it, or I don't know. It wasn't my thing. But anyway, one time when I was in an elementary school, I was working with another teacher, and we were doing the touchy-feely bag. And the touchy-feely bag was a bag, and you'd put objects in it, and then the kids would have to reach into the bag and pick something up, and without looking at it, you know, they have to think, they have to figure out what it is. So what would you put in there? You'd put in sort of cold, wet spaghetti. You put in a boiled egg. Um, you might put in a feather, anything, that has a shape that kids could identify. And of course, I tried this. I was trying it with the other teacher that was there, and some of the things were easy to figure out right away. You knew other things you weren't so sure. And I started to notice it's such a fascinating experience. I highly recommend it. Like, just get a bag, and you have to get a friend to put stuff in it, because if you know what's in there, then that's not going to really work. So you have to get a friend to put stuff in your touchy feely bag. And then what happens is you reach into the bag and let them find things that are hard, not going to be too easy. And you touch something and you're feeling it. And there's that wonderful sense when you don't yet know what it is, right? But you're touching it, but you haven't yet figured it out. And you can feel like your mind just opens to possibility. And everything gets very sensitive and sort of alive. And then you'll notice that moment where you go, oh, that's a boiled egg. And it literally has this feeling of, oh, that's a boiled egg. Everything just collapses. That's a boiled egg. That all the sensitivity just goes psst, gone. It disappears. The same thing happens in the morning. This is my favorite thing, and it doesn't happen enough. But if you've been traveling and then you wake up in the morning, and I'm sure this has happened to everybody, you wake up in the morning and for a second you don't remember where you are. Maybe you've been traveling and you're home, or maybe you're away and you're in a hotel, and you wake up and it's not familiar, and for a second or two you like, huh, where am I? And when that happens to me, I try to close my eyes so that I can just live in the reality that I don't know where I am, because it's got the same experience of like, just everything opens up and suddenly there's all this receptivity of possibility. I don't know where I am. I don't remember. But it doesn't last very long, because your brain is too smart. So it goes, no, no, no. Last night you were at this thing, and you slept at your friend's house, and that's where you were. But as soon as you remember where it is, you can feel your reality just stabilizes back in place again. And so you go from this place of being wide open and uncertain to a place of being certain. And we, as Thomas Kuhn said, we like certainty. Uncertainty makes us nervous, and we like certainty, but uncertainty is the key to paradigm shifting. We have to find a way to be uncertain about things that we don't have any rational reason to be uncertain about. And the more obvious, the more obviously true those things are, the more difficult it will be to find authentic uncertainty around them. But the more fruitful will be the paradigm shift, because those will be much deeper in the ground of our assumptions. And if we shake those up, they'll have much bigger consequences moving forward. The paradigm shift around the penny in the machine, that had a huge effect on the 15 scientists that were working on this project. But it didn't really ripple out beyond that, as far as I know. I don't think anybody in the building next door had any effect from that paradigm shift. But some paradigm shifts
But
do have
I'm not,
huge ripple effects. And those are the ones that I think we all know our world needs. We need big paradigm shifts. We need we need to examine some of our most fundamental assumptions so that things can change and in powerful ways that are much bigger maybe than we can even imagine. And so I think, Steve, I'm going to leave it right there. Um, so those are my thoughts about paradigm shifting. This is definitely one of my favorite topics. And yeah,
Great.
I'm happy to engage in any way you like.
Yeah. Thanks, Jeff. That was great. So now we can just open it up for Q&A. Raise your hand using the raise hand button if you have a question, a reflection, something from your breakout group before the talk that kind of relates. I'll start with you, Steve, and then we'll go to John.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. Thanks, John, for letting me go first. So I want to just ask you to say a little bit more regarding this idea of a little bit of not knowing and
Yes.
the various ways you phrased it. And that was really excellent. I mean, it's sometimes it's just so simple, like the idea of the Earth going backwards as the sun is setting. I want to ask you to speak about how the practice of wise non-attachment, kind of a famous Buddhist practice of, emotion, like kind of having a degree of emotional freedom from, the troubles or problems in our lives, and how that practice, especially when it's, moderated by loving engagement, right? You don't want to just be checked out, but that it's the reason I bring it up is because it's a practice that I've taken on more recently and found very beneficial. And it seems to me that there's a connection between being non-attached and a little bit of not knowing. And so maybe you could elaborate and tell me whether you think that those ideas are related.
I mean, I definitely think they're related. Um, and I'm not exactly sure what kind of practice you're doing, but I'm assuming that it is, if you're describing it as non-attachment, then it's a kind of basically a witnessing, some kind of a witnessing
Yeah, with
posture.
an attitudinal distance, that in a sense that recognizing what I'm not in control of, or recognizing how
Yes,
that as an expression of faith that all things work together for good, eventually, that I can sit back a little bit and not be, neurotically concerned about the things that I'm lovingly engaged with.
yes, definitely. Well, I think there's two things that I would say about that. One is more hmm, one is less profound, one is more profound. Both are powerful though. In the less profound sense, uh, we tend to be so reactive to our minds. You know, stuff happens in mind, bam. Like, in fact, our response to things that happen in our minds is often so fast it seems to be the same event. The arising of something that makes us angry and the response of anger happens simultaneously and seem like they're the same event. And so through the kinds of practices you're talking about, you can start to relax the reactivity. And really, relaxing reactivity is an absolute essential pretty much for any kind of development, because if you are completely lost in reactivity, there's not really much that can happen uh, just because you're so reactive. If we want to talk about paradigm shifting, that's a big that needs to be a big loss of reactivity, because if you're going to start to question some of the most fundamental assumptions that your foundational reality is based on, you know, you have to be rock solid steady, able to like handle that, able to live through it. The American philosopher Richard Rorty talked about our final language. He said every person has a final language, which means they have a they have a language at the bottom of everything they could possibly say, which is their actual bottom line belief about reality. And people are willing to question everything except that. When you get to that, because that means you're going to shake up your whole world. And so you need to be very non reactive for that. The more profound way that I can relate this from my own experience is, and this is because to me enlightenment, what you could call enlightenment is one way to think about it is it's a paradigm shift. And so if you are practicing meditation and you decide that you are going to disengage, right? That basically you're going to disengage from your mind, and then you start doing it. What happens? Well, what you find is nothing happens. The mind just keeps right on going, right? It just keeps going, and then and eventually you think, well, I'm not very good at meditating because you think your mind should stop. Most people give up because their mind won't stop. But if you don't give up and you keep going, eventually it dawns on you that you actually are disengaged. It's just that your habit of assuming you're the thinker of the thoughts is so strong that you think you're doing all that. And eventually you land in a place where you go, oh my God, all of that thinking is just happening. I was never doing any of that. It's just an unfolding of habits of mind. And my assumption that I was somehow the active thinker of those thoughts was so strong that that's how I experienced it. And then you rest in a place, and then it just keeps going. This is a wormhole inquiry. You fall in that wormhole, and then pretty soon you're just going, oh, my God, I was never the thinker of any of these thoughts. They've always just been happening. And then you start going, well, what am I anyway? It just goes deeper and deeper. But that's how this kind of inquiry goes. So that would be the more profound way that I would relate that kind of practice to paradigm shifting.
Great. Thanks very much.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thanks. All right, let's go on to John and then Sally. And remember, just raise your hand using the react button if you have a question, a challenge and support comment, or relating it to something that came up in your breakout group. All right, John, go for it.
I know that, Jeff, you were going fairly quickly through Kuhn's theory because we have other topics to go through. I'm also a big fan of Kuhn. I've used him quite a bit
Yeah.
in my own work, but I do want to add one additional aspect, which I think is useful for the thesis here. The first point that you made about the insolvable problem, which Kuhn called the anomaly, and it's an anomaly because for normal science, which is the current paradigm, the rules say it can't happen, it can't exist, right? And Kuhn said, well, those who typically solve the anomalies are either very young people or people who are new to the field, people who don't know and haven't lived by those rules. That give them a flexibility of thought that somebody who's built their reputation on those rules doesn't have. And this connects to the topic I gave in the discussion group about when I wrote an article with Shawnee's Bjørgen Hargens about ET and extraterrestrial for a group of communicators, and there was a violent blowback because even though we weren't advocating, we were just arguing that, there are forms of evidence that one uses, and this is important if you're working in a national park or a heritage area. But what I discovered is that it bumped up against people's rules, against their mental models. It bumped up against the boggle threshold, if you're familiar with that term. And immediately they could no longer process or proceed in their thinking process. So that's what I wanted to add, is the notion of a boggle threshold is very relevant to this, right? As defining the boundaries of our paradigm, even if those boundaries are completely artificial.
Absolutely. Definitely. That's very good. I'm going to just share something quickly with you because I think you all had Jeffrey Kripal on here recently. I think Steve told me
No,
that.
we haven't had Jeffrey yet.
Okay, you haven't had Jeffrey yet. Well, maybe someday you will. So I was at his one of his symposiums a couple of years ago, and so Jeffrey Kripal is he explores all kinds of paranormal sorts of phenomena, and he was talking about, and mystical experiences, and he was talking about mystical experiences and how they're not accepted, and you'll have them and people won't accept them, and you'll get rejected and you'll get pushback, and he's gotten a lot of pushback from his talks about mystical experience, etc. And I was like right on board. And then he started to talk about or other people started to talk about their ET experiences and all the blowback that they would get from their ET experiences. And I saw it in myself. Oh, I don't have the same relationship to those as I do to the mystical experience. Like the ET ones are sort of outside of my domain. So I find it, I was somewhat dismissive of the ET experiences in a way that I never am of people's mystical experiences. And so I've been embarking on an exploration of ET phenomena because I realized, well, I just haven't spent much time with it. And it is a fascinating topic. So I just wanted to throw that in, John, but I completely agree with you that there is that threshold. I was reaching my threshold with ET. And yeah, so who knows? Maybe someday you'll have Jeffrey on here. You'd be fun.
Cool. Thanks. All right, Sally and then Elaine.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. It's a fascinating topic. And I absolutely agree with you that, as Einstein said, we can't solve these problems with the same consciousness that created them. So in my life, the most important thing for me is understand emergence, which in my viewpoint is creativity itself, the phenomenon of a creative universe that is constantly creating. And humans are a small fractal of that. So for me to understand what that phenomenon is has become a central drive in my life. So teaching students has helped me really understand, because I've had to inspire students to become more creative. That's a passion of mine. How are we going to change this world? It's through paradigm shifts. So that's a subset of creativity. So there's a couple of things I just want to run through. One of them is understanding that brain waves affect how creative you are, that if you come into theta brain waves, you can access more imagination than if you're stuck in beta brain waves. So understanding the brain itself is critical to encouraging creativity, and how to access theta becomes a practice. And as meditators, we all begin to understand how to do that. Especially as we wake up in the morning and go to sleep at night, we move through theta and we enter dream states. So accessing the subconscious becomes a practice for me and my students anyway, because the more internal you go, the more you can access this deep source of inspiration that is inside of you. So there's that. Other things like in McGilchrist's work, understanding the difference between left and right brain, that becomes a practice, because the more you access the right brain, the more imagination you can access. So for scientists, you mentioned scientists in particular, creativity does exist in the science field, but not as much as in other fields. So I've been generally looking at what is the differences. And, one of the answers is McGilchrist's work on what the left brain does and what the right brain does. And that's the science and the arts difference right there. So there's that. More access of the right brain. Is personality. There's been a lot of studies on who is actually creative, not everybody. And so we look at personality as well, and risk takers, people who are open to novel experience, people who are curious, people who are receptive and deep listeners, people who are what we call divergent thinkers as opposed to convergent thinkers. It's a style of thought which goes with personality. And I'll just briefly explain. So that's people who prefer to be right, to be certain. They can't tolerate ambiguity, and prefer to be liked, or not deeply creative. So personality is another really important thing. Not everybody.
Sally, can you kind of wrap it up? We have two more people, and I just want to make sure we have time for them.
I just wanted to say that there's so many ways to encourage creativity. Brainwaves, encouraging practices of right brain, and personality. So it's such a complex topic. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Sally. Elaine, and then Eric.
Jeff, it's great to see you here. And
nice to see you too.
In the small group, I was sharing my experience of a worldview shift. I don't call it paradigm shift, and I'm wondering whether you make a difference yourself. For me, for instance, a worldview that I am not separate from anything else. Or at least I am the universe. I'm part of the universe, but I'm also the universe. Can you say a little bit, because you've talked mostly about paradigm at this time, and without putting too much emphasis on words, but is there a difference in terms of depth of between a worldview and a paradigm shift?
I mean, I don't think I would want to make a big distinction between those two. I mean, I suppose we could, but I'd be making it up. So I don't. I would be happy to leave those two as more or less the same, and I'm sure we could parse it out a little bit, but I don't see any reason to. I would call what you described as a worldview shift. I'd be happy calling that a paradigm shift.
Okay, good. Thank you, Jeff.
Right.
That's great.
Eric, and then David.
Yeah, hello everyone. Good to be with you. So a thought came through that I'm just bringing into this space, and this is Jeff. It's great to be with you again.
Nice to see you too.
Wonderful. I really appreciated your presentation. The part towards the end where you said, I thought I was a thinker, and then I found out it's just the thinking is going on. And so earlier today, I was on another call where they were talking about fields a lot, and that space is not empty was the title of a new book by the authors who were there. And anyway, just what was arising was this notion that, how do we take that another step up from the individual to the collective? Just as I might think I am the thinker, but no, the thinking is going on. We might think that we are a bunch of individuals here who are assembling because Steve McIntosh is a cool philosopher guy who's holding this Zoom group on Wednesdays once a month, and that we are, coming here with our agency to, participate in this discussion, to listen to you tonight, which is true on one level, but it's kind of amusing to me to consider that, what is this emergent property? What's bringing this together? If I suspend the notion of, 40 of us or whatever who are gathering a certain way to, we are being moved by something that is creating this moment, and to just take some time to entertain that. That's all.
Yeah, that's great. I don't know if there was a question in there, but I think two things strike me, because you were sort of alluding to this in relationship to the collective. Two things struck me. One is I think if you keep going down that wormhole of I'm not the thinker, thoughts are just happening, what am I, you eventually start to experience this moment as just an emergence. You sort of go beyond the individual or any ideas of individual. There's just an emergence of being occurring all the time. And sometimes the emergence of being shows up as a bunch of people on a Zoom call, and sometimes it shows up as you alone in the woods, but it's constantly this emergence of being. And the other thing, which might be more practical, is if you are able to enter that kind of space, that Steve was talking about earlier, that detachment. But you do it with other people, things get really interesting. If a number of people detach themselves from the mind together and then experience the kind of love and trust that occurs when we meet beyond our ideas, that's a world-changing event for sure. So those are the two things I would strike me in relationship to what you said, Eric. Thank you.
Great. All right. David, can you get a quick one in, and then we'll wrap things up?
Sure. Thank you. I appreciated your talk here, Jeff. Thank you so much. What do you see as some helpful things to keep in mind when we're cultivating paradigm shifts that sort of limit the downside of provoking a overly destabilizing ontological shock?
Well, I mean, okay, so obviously that could be a very big topic, but I'll handle it.
I know
quickly.
I was at the very end. Sorry for a big topic
No,
here.
that's fine. I'm just giving an excuse for my woefully inadequate answer before I've even given it. Um, um, when we're talking about, because what we're talking about here, we're talking about paradigm shifts, but really we're talking about kind of a very profound form of growth, of expansion of consciousness. Whenever we're talking about profound growth or expansions in consciousness, uh, shock of all different kinds is possible, right? There are definitely negative ramifications. There's shock. There is disassociations that can occur, right? This disengagement can become disassociation, et cetera, et cetera. There's all kinds of potential dangers. My personal feeling is that those dangers get dramatically reduced if we just remember that this kind of growth is never something that you should force. You don't use force. And the analogy that I like to use is this is a growth. A paradigm shift is growth. Spiritual awakening is growth. So what does that mean? It's like a flower. A flower grows. If you plant a flower in the ground and you see the little shoot pop up, you don't pull on it, right? You don't go, oh, I'm going to help it grow, and then you pop it on. That's how shock occurs. That's how damage occurs. When you're mechanically trying to force something that's inherently a growth. Growth has to happen. So all of these things, whether it's paradigm shifting or spiritual work, or what you're doing is you're cultivating you're cultivating the circumstances or the environment that are most conducive to growth, just like you would do with a child, right? Or a plant. What do? You give it water. You give it sunlight. You give it food. Or if it's a child, you give it an education. You give it food, and you give it a loving environment. You give it things that are conducive to healthy growth. The same thing's true of paradigm shifting. You need to create a circumstance that's conducive to healthy growth, which means it needs to be largely free of, it needs to be free of force, but it also needs to be free of tension. Tension's not a great environment for the expansion of consciousness. You need ease of being. You need relaxation. It can't get too intense. Obviously, a certain amount of intensity is important, but if you want to grow in a way that's going to remain healthy and safe, you want to give a lot of energy to it. It's important. So you give a lot of energy to it. You give a lot of attention to it. You give a lot of passion to it. You give a lot of love to it, a lot of sensitivity to it. There's a lot of things you want to give to it, but you don't give it force. You don't give it tension. You can't make it happen. And unfortunately, we live in a culture which we tend to believe in making things happen, and if you're building a house, you make that happen. You know, there's things you do make happen, but growth is not one of them. So we need to learn how to treat our paradigm shift as a living growth. You know, just know that this is a living being that you're caring for, not a mechanical machine that you are forcing. So that would be my relatively short answer to a big question. Thank you, David.
Yeah. Beautifully said. Well, thank you so much, Jeff. We pulled it off.
We did.
So that was really great. Just one quick announcement. Next month's meeting will be December 10th. That's the second Wednesday. And I believe it's going to be with Jeff Salzman. Is that right? All right.
Jeff's going to give us his yearly wrap up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Fun.
All right. Well, so good to see you all, and I'll see you next month.
Thanks very much, Jeff. That was really excellent. Enjoyed it thoroughly.
Oh,
And it was great to see
thank you,
everyone.
Steve.
And look forward to seeing you next month.
That
Thanks,
was wonderful.
everyone.
Thank you
All right.
all.
Thanks,
Great
Rigel.
to see you all.
Thanks, Steve.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Excellent talk. Thank you.
Thank you.